Now to an NBC News exclusive. The man who stood at the center of some of the storms that engulfed the Trump presidency is breaking his silence tonight. Former Attorney General William Barr, in his new memoir, One Damn Thing After Another, opens up about his relationship with the former president. And ahead of the book's release, he opened up to me.
People really started going after me when they saw that I was not going to take the rubbish that was the Russiagate pseudo-scandal. I was going to deal with it.
Defiant in his convictions, Bill Barr gives no ground to his critics.
The narrative, and we live in the age of narrative, not facts. The narrative was I was a toady to Trump, and I would do Trump's bidding, and the media constantly went out with that story.
Were you?
Well, I think no, because I tried to take every issue that came to me and decided what I thought was the right thing, and I didn't really care what people thought about me.
The criticism that framed Barr's time in the Trump administration actually started before he even took the job, when as a private citizen, he wrote an unsolicited memo to the Department of Justice outlining why the president should not be investigated in the Mueller probe.
Many people look at that memo as an audition for the job of Attorney General. Look at this. This is how I lean.
Well, first, I wasn't interested in being Attorney General, and second, if I wanted to be Attorney General, there were much more direct ways of auditioning for it.
Some thought the memo was a signal to the president that Barr was ready to make the Russia investigation go away.
Your mind sounds like it was clearly made up before we even got to this point on the Russia investigation, that it was a phony investigation.
No, it wasn't made up. I was, as I say in my book, I was suspicious of it. It didn't ring true to me.
Months after Barr wrote that memo, the president fired Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who had refused to intervene in the Mueller investigation. The president offered the job to Barr. 5 weeks after his confirmation, the Mueller report was in his hands.
This is all we know. Bob Mueller has submitted his report to the Attorney General, period.
Barr says he couldn't legally release the full report at first. Classified and grand jury information needed to be redacted. Instead, he wrote a 4-page letter to Congress about Mueller's conclusions.
And the conclusions were there was no collusion and that he didn't make a decision on obstruction, but he lays out all the facts in the report. And I say that he does not exonerate Trump.
But critics say Barr essentially did exonerate the president. He said Mueller's evidence did not prove Trump obstructed justice. It became a mantra that stuck.
There is absolutely no collusion. That has been proven.
There was no obstruction.
Among the details that Barr left out, Mueller's description of multiple acts by the president that were capable of exerting undue influence over law enforcement investigations.
This 4-page letter, this summary, was immediately met with wide criticism that it didn't really accurately reflect what Mueller was saying.
Well, that's not true. What it was a tantrum by the people who were hoping that Mueller would be able to bring down Trump.
Wait a minute. Mueller himself wrote you a letter complaining. He said the summary didn't capture the substance of his report and that there was now public confusion.
No, he didn't say the substance of his report.
Actually, he did. Mueller's letter said Barr's summary did not fully capture the context, nature, and substance of this office's work and conclusions. In his book, Barr frequently defends Trump, but there were flashpoints, like that so-called perfect phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, now a wartime leader. Trump called on Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden.
This whole maneuver of trying to get the Ukrainians to investigate Biden, that was a harebrained scheme. It was ridiculous.
In that call, Trump offered up his attorney general to help facilitate the scheme. Barr says he had nothing to do with it.
And the president lumped you in with Rudy Giuliani as being the points of contact to make this happen.
I was livid.
4 weeks after the election, Barr's relationship with the president came to a head when he told a reporter there was no widespread election fraud, that Trump had simply lost. It led to a blow-up at the White House.
And I told him that all this stuff was bullshit and about election fraud. And was wrong to be shoveling it out the way his team was.
You're trying to set him straight.
Yes. And he listened. He was obviously getting very angry about this. I said, okay, well, look, I understand you're upset with me, and I'm perfectly happy to tender my resignation. And then, boom, he slapped the desk and he said, accepted, go home, you're done.
In a 3-page letter to NBC News, President Trump called Barr's book fake and repeatedly insulted his former AG as a coward, a big disappointment, and lazy. Trump also said that he was the one who demanded Barr's resignation.
You can watch more of our conversation tomorrow on Today and on a special hour this Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 Central. Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.